The rain had not stopped for 7 days. It fell in thin, cold needles that bit through uniforms, ran down sandbags, and turned the soil into a choking soup of mud and rot. The trenches outside Ypres were not trenches anymore, they were open graves lined with wooden slats and prayers that had long stopped working. Private Thomas Avery stared across the field, his rifle propped against the parapet. The horizon was nothing but mist and wire. The air smelled of cordite, sulfur, and something worse, the smell that clung to everything here. He had arrived in Flanders a year ago, a schoolteacher from Bath who thought duty meant honor. Now, he barely remembered what either word meant. The war had eaten it all. A faint sound carried through the wind, singing. Someone down the line was humming an old hymn. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The voice trembled but did not break. It floated above the slop and ruin, soft as candlelight in the dark. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered the next line under his breath. The darkness deepens, Lord with me abide. When he opened them again, the hymn was gone. So was the man who had been singing it. That night, Thomas sat inside a crumbling farmhouse turned aid station. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, and the roof sagged under the weight of endless rain. The smell of carbolic acid and wet wool mixed with blood and smoke. A single lantern burned in the corner, throwing trembling light across a table where he sat with Corporal William Miller, his closest friend. Miller was older, a miner from Manchester with calloused hands and a mouth that never seemed to close. He was the kind of man who could find a joke in anything, until now. You ever think about home? Miller asked, scraping the mud from his boots. Every night, Thomas said. I try not to. Hurts too much. Thomas unfolded a small, crumpled photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed a woman in a white dress standing in front of a rose bush. Her eyes were kind, though the edges of the photo had worn away. My wife, Anna, he murmured. She still writes. Says the garden's grown wild without me. Miller smiled faintly. Wild's better than dead. A shell burst somewhere in the distance, shaking dust from the rafters. Both men froze, listening. Then silence again, thick, waiting silence. Thomas sighed. They say the Germans have something new. A weapon. Gas shells, they call them. Miller spat into the fire. I've heard. They say it's invisible. Death you can't see, Thomas whispered. As if the rest wasn't enough. Dawn came grey and bitter. A fog rolled in from the east, swallowing the no-man's land in a pale curtain. The men stirred, coughing, their uniforms stiff from the cold. Then came the sound, distant, hollow pops echoing across the plain. Artillery. But not like before. These shells did not explode. They hissed. Gas, someone screamed down the line. Gas! Gas! Masks on. The trenches erupted into chaos. Men scrambled, fumbling for their respirators, knocking over rifles and lanterns. The fog shifted color, first white, then sickly green, then yellow, curling low like the fingers of some monstrous hand. Thomas pulled on his mask, the rubber clinging to his skin, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Through the small glass lenses, the world turned warped and unreal. He could hear them, the coughing, the screaming, the tearing of throats as the gas found them. He stumbled toward Miller's section, shouting through the muffled filter. Miller! Where are you? A shadow moved through the haze, a figure crawling on hands and knees. Thomas dropped beside him and rolled him over. It was Miller. His mask was shattered, one of the lenses cracked open, his eyes red and weeping. He clawed weakly at his throat, gasping for air that was poison. Thomas tore a wet rag from his coat and pressed it over Miller's mouth, shouting, "Breathe through this. Do you hear me? Breathe." Miller tried, but his body convulsed. The gas had already done its work. Around them, the fog thickened until the world was nothing but sound, the gurgle of dying men, the hiss of gas seeping through cracks, the moaning of the wind that carried it. Thomas dragged Miller by the arms, his boot sinking into the mud with every step. His lungs burned even inside the mask, he could feel the sting leaking in through the seams. He didn't stop. He wouldn't leave him. When they reached the farmhouse, Thomas collapsed beside Miller, tearing his own mask off to give the man his coat for air. He could taste it now, the metal tang of chlorine, sharp and cruel. His eyes flooded with tears, his throat closing like a fist around his breath. "Don't you quit," he rasped. "Not you." Miller reached for him, barely conscious. Why didn't you run?" "Because you wouldn't have." The door shuddered as shells fell closer. The world outside burned in green light. Then, finally, silence again, broken only by the soft, ragged breaths of two men who refused to die. Night crept in quietly, heavy with the scent of chlorine and death. The wind had shifted westward, carrying the last traces of gas away from the trench. It was a mercy too late for hundreds. The once crowded line now whispered with only the faint, shallow breaths of the few who had survived. Thomas sat beside Miller, a rag wrapped around his own raw mouth, his skin burning from the gas that had brushed against it. Miller's face was grey, his lips blue, his chest rising and falling in uneven spasms. Every breath sounded like a saw through wet wood. Thomas reached for his canteen and poured a few drops of muddy water on Miller's cracked lips. The older man stirred, eyes fluttering open. "You're still here," Miller rasped. "Always," Thomas said softly. "You'll be all right. We'll get you to the medics." Miller gave a weak smile that barely reached his eyes. "You're a worse liar than the recruiters." Thomas tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough. He tore open a morphine ampoule from his medical pouch and jabbed it gently into Miller's arm. The soldier sighed, relief washing over his battered face. Outside, the rain returned, a light drizzle at first, then a steady rhythm that tapped against the tin roof. Each drop seemed to count time, like the slow beat of a watch marking the end of a day no one should have survived. Thomas looked toward the doorway. Through the cracks of the shattered boards, the horizon glowed faintly green, lit by the last embers of artillery fire. Somewhere in that poisoned haze, he could hear faint cries, men still alive, lost between the lines. He hesitated. He knew what command would say, "Stay put until dawn." The gas lingered low in the craters, anyone who went out now was signing his own death sentence. But he couldn't ignore the voices. He grabbed his mask, adjusted the straps, and stood. "Stay here, Miller." "You're mad," Miller croaked. "Maybe," Thomas replied. "But they're still out there." He stepped into the night. The air outside bit like acid. Even through the respirator, Thomas could feel the burn on his skin, the faint taste of copper with every breath. The battlefield was unrecognizable, a twisted, ghostly ruin of men and earth. Shell craters filled with greenish water, barbed wire draped like skeleton ribs across the mud. He moved slowly, crouched low, his boots sinking into the muck. The cries were clearer now, one to his left, another farther ahead. He followed the nearer one first. In the shadow of a collapsed trench wall lay a soldier, British by the insignia on his sleeve. The man's mask was gone, his face swollen and blistered, eyes blind from the gas. He groped weakly at the air. "Help me," he whispered. Thomas knelt beside him, his gloved hands trembling. "I've got you." He slipped a cloth over the man's face, poured a few drops of water onto it, and began dragging him toward the farmhouse. Each step was agony, the mud clung to his legs like tar, and the man was dead weight. Halfway back, Thomas heard another sound, the low scrape of boots behind him. He froze, turned, and saw a shadow move through the haze. A German soldier. The figure staggered, clutching his throat. His mask dangled from one hand, his rifle forgotten in the mud. His gas-soaked uniform clung to him like a shroud. Thomas raised his weapon instinctively, then stopped. The man wasn't a threat, he was dying. Their eyes met through the fog. In that instant, there was no uniform, no enemy, only two men caught in the same nightmare. The German fell to his knees, choking, reaching out. Thomas looked down at the British soldier at his feet, then at the German struggling before him. He made a choice. He dropped his rifle, pulled a spare rag from his pocket, and soaked it with the last of his water. Then he pressed it to the German's mouth. "Breathe," he said softly, his voice muffled behind the mask. "Breathe, damn you." The man obeyed, shuddering, gasping weakly through the wet cloth. Thomas knelt there between them, one man from each side, his arms trembling under their weight, the gas swirling around them like the breath of death itself. And for a moment, he wondered if this was what salvation looked like, helping strangers die a little slower in a world gone mad. When he returned to the farmhouse, dawn had begun to bleed across the sky. The fog glowed pale yellow, and the silence was unbearable. He laid both men side by side on the floor, the British soldier barely breathing, the German unconscious. Miller stirred in the corner, his voice hoarse. "You brought one of them back." Thomas nodded. "He's just a man, same as us." "Same as us?" Miller coughed. "He's the reason we're choking in our own lungs." "He didn't make the gas," Thomas said quietly. "He's just trying to survive it." Miller turned away. "You're going to get yourself killed for mercy." Thomas didn't answer. He knew Miller wasn't wrong. But something inside him refused to let go of what little humanity was left. He sat there as the morning light crept through the holes in the roof, painting thin lines across the mud-streaked floor. The war outside had paused, no shells, no gunfire, only the wind moving softly through the broken world. He realized, for the first time, that he wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified him was living in a world that forgot compassion. By mid-morning, the wind had shifted again, sweeping away the last traces of gas and leaving the battlefield coated in a heavy, unnatural stillness. The only sound inside the farmhouse was the faint rasp of breathing, the Millers, the British soldiers, and the Germans. Thomas sat near the doorway, his mask hanging loosely around his neck. The early light fell across his hands, cracked, red, and trembling. He stared at them as though they no longer belonged to him. Outside, shapes began to move through the mist, figures in British helmets, advancing cautiously over the ruins. Reinforcements. He rose unsteadily, stepping out to signal them. His voice cracked when he called out, "Over here!" "Survivors!" The nearest soldier spotted him and waved. Within minutes, a small group approached, medics among them. "What's your unit?" one of the officers demanded. 8th Battalion, Thomas said weakly. "We were hit by gas last night. Most didn't make it." The officer's expression hardened as he looked past Thomas into the farmhouse. "Who's that inside?" "Wounded," Thomas said. "2 of ours, and 1 of theirs." The officer froze. "You brought a German here." Thomas met his eyes. "He was dying. I couldn't leave him." "That's not your decision to make, Private." Thomas didn't argue. He simply stepped aside as the medics entered. They lifted the wounded British soldier first, his pulse faint, his face blistered. The German was next. The medic hesitated. "Sir, he's bad off." "Still breathing?" Thomas asked. "Barely." "Then he's alive. Treat him." The officer scowled. "You've gone soft, soldier. That's the man who gassed your friends." Thomas's voice was calm, almost distant. He didn't light the fuse. The officer said nothing more, only turned and barked orders for the stretcher bearers. As they carried the men away, Thomas caught Miller's gaze. The older man's eyes were clouded with exhaustion and disbelief. "You're not the same man I met in Somme, Tom." "None of us are," Thomas said. Hours later, the survivors were loaded onto trucks bound for the rear lines. The rumble of the engines filled the silence. Thomas sat in the back, staring at the floorboards while the countryside crawled past, dead fields, shattered trees, the black smoke of distant shells. Beside him, the German lay on a stretcher, still unconscious. His breathing was shallow but steady. One of the medics murmured, "Strange, isn't it? Saving the enemy." Thomas didn't look up. "He's not my enemy right now." The medic chuckled softly. "You'll get court-martialed for thinking like that." "Then they'll have to find something else to take from me," Thomas said. "War already took the rest." When they reached the field hospital, the medics unloaded the wounded. The officer in charge ordered the German placed in a separate tent, guarded. Thomas lingered by the truck, watching them carry the man away. "Private Avery," the officer barked. "You're due for debrief. Move along." Thomas saluted and followed, his mind elsewhere. That night, he sat alone in the medical tent, his lungs aching, his vision swimming from the remnants of gas exposure. On the cot beside him lay Miller, asleep under morphine. A nurse passed by, young, weary, her uniform stained with blood and mud. She paused at his side. "You're Thomas Avery, right? The one who pulled 3 men out during the attack." Thomas nodded slowly. She smiled faintly. "You saved that German too. They're talking about it in camp. Some are calling you mad. Maybe I am." Her voice softened. "Or maybe you remember what the rest of us forgot." He looked up at her. "And what's that?" "That mercy is a kind of courage," she said quietly. "It's rarer than medals." When she left, Thomas stared at the tent ceiling for a long time, listening to the muffled moans of the wounded around him. The smell of antiseptic and burnt cloth filled the air, the smell of survival, he thought. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph, Anna, his wife, standing in a field back home, sunlight caught in her hair. He had looked at it 100 times, but tonight it felt heavier, as if the memory itself were tired. He turned the photo over. On the back was a faint smear of mud, his, or perhaps the German's, he couldn't tell anymore. He took out his pencil and wrote, in slow, uneven script, "Anna, if I make it home, know this, I've seen the enemy, and he has my face. And I don't know what peace means anymore, only that it isn't made by killing." He folded the photo and placed it back against his chest. A week later, the order came for him to return to the front. The trenches had quieted but were far from silent. Rumors spread that another offensive was coming. Before he left, he went to the small tent where the German was kept. The guard outside barely noticed him. Inside, the man lay awake, pale, thin, eyes hollow but aware. Thomas stepped forward. "You're alive." The man's lips cracked into a faint smile. His English was broken. "Because you did not shoot." Thomas knelt. "No one deserves to die like that." The German nodded weakly. Then maybe, one day, no one will. Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of his rations, a small piece of bread. He set it beside the man. "Keep it," Thomas said. The German whispered, "Dank." When Thomas stepped out into the cold morning light, the wind carried the distant echo of artillery again, a grim reminder that peace was still far away. He pulled his coat tight, lifted his rifle, and walked toward the trucks waiting to take them back to the lines. He didn't look back.